My parents used to fight a lot. Bickering turned into shouting, which turned into curfews, which usually led to my dad having to sleep downstairs on the sofa or in the guest room. This was just how my family functioned, and I was used to it. They'd keep their arguments behind closed doors and thin walls to create an impression of privacy. I blamed myself a lot. I could always make out the sound of my name, but the muffled, hysteric rambling drowned out any context for the sudden mention. I used to cry when I was younger, my legs trembling as I covered my head with my pillow, trying to deafen myself and get some much-needed sleep. By the time I turned 17, my tears had run dry, but my mom's imagination for my dad's punishment didn't. He's been sleeping in the garden for months now. The day it began, I was inside playing video games. My friends were busy on family holidays and outings, so I played by myself. Despite some people finding things like this depressing, I was in fact far from it and enjoying myself immensely. I loved playing single players. Shooters, role-playing, survival, fantasy, you name it. There I was someone else. I was someone worth attention. A sudden babble of shouts and screams broke the silence as I rolled my eyes and turned up the game's volume. I was playing a platformer, and it required all my attention to make sure I didn't mess it up. A loud slam echoed throughout the house, followed by another muffled shout. This caught me out. My parents yelled, screamed, and roared, but they never hit each other. They never broke furniture or ornaments or anything of the sort. I tiptoed to the top of the stairs and sat on the top step, peering my head through the banister. My mom had slammed the glass screen shut as she jabbed a finger at my dad on the other side. "You better sort it out." My dad was completely beside himself. He was completely red in the face, his eyes bloodshot and bulging as he smudged the glass with his hands pressing against it and pleading with my mom to be let back inside. "Please, Jane, please, I can't!" My mom ignored him and stormed into the kitchen. I ducked my head out of the way as she passed below, before slamming another door shut behind her. I peered back again. My dad had 3 deep gashes across his cheek. Blood trickled down past his chin, staining the neck of his shirt, which was completely drenched. They must have gotten into a really bad argument for my dad to sweat so much like that, and for my mom to scratch him the way she did. I carefully stood up, making sure to not make the floor beneath me creak, and walked back into my room, softly closing the door. I never liked to pick sides with my parents. I felt guilty if I did, and it would eat away at me for weeks. I ignored my dad's pleas to be let back inside. Sometimes I would go out to see him or bring him some food and drink, but I made sure to leave as little a gap as possible when I opened the door to go back in. This continued for 2 weeks. My dad seemed to have a routine by now. I'd catch him asleep from morning to midday before walking laps around the garden, doing push-ups, sweeping, trimming bushes and hedges, cutting the grass, and when the sun set and darkness fell, he would pull a chair up to our pond and stare into the murky depths. We had koi fish, something my dad decided to buy behind my mom's back. I think he liked them more than he let on. He looked tired. He hadn't changed out of his clothes at all as the blood stain grew darker each day and flaked off. His face was covered in mud and grit from his chores, and his hair and beard were beginning to become unkempt. I was woken one night to a low sound of sobbing. I sat up in bed and peered out of my window. I saw my dad still staring into the pond, his tears glistening in the moonlight and trickling off his face, sending ripples in the water. I checked my alarm clock and was shocked to find that it read 3 a.m. I couldn't stand it anymore. The next morning I confronted my mom. "Mom, is it really necessary for Dad to sleep in the garden?" My mom froze at the kitchen sink and slowly turned to face me. In a serious and stern tone, she said, "Yes, it is," before turning back to the sink without uttering another word or altering her expression. I was lost for words. This had gone on long enough. I shot up, sending my chair scraping behind me, and walked out into the garden, slamming the glass door behind me while pacing towards my dad. "Dad, you need to fix things with Mom. This has gone on long enough." He stared at me in silence, his eyes darting around the garden and towards the pond. His lip began to quiver. I can't. Go back inside now." Why were they both so cagey? I couldn't believe what he was saying. Out of the two of them, My dad is usually the one to whine for attention, trying to coach me over to his side with puppy eyes that just made him look more like a bulldog with his grizzled face. I threw my hands up in the air in annoyance, spun around back to the door, and went inside. The following night I was woken to the sound of soft mumbling. Same as the previous night, I sat up in bed, glanced at my alarm clock, which read 1:30 a.m., and peered out into the garden. It was my parents. They were both outside, sitting side by side, staring into the pond. Bathing in the moonlight, their skin pale white and void of blemishes. I couldn't make out what they were saying, as both their lips fluttered further, igniting the argument. My mom slowly rose from her seat and placed her hand on his shoulder, kissing him on the cheek, before walking back towards the house. I saw her pause for a moment, about to say something, before catching herself and deciding against it as she entered the house. The following morning, my dad remained in the garden. He would stay there for the next 2 months, repeating the same routine day in and day out. I've had to speak to his boss over the landline and make up some excuse that he was very sick and wouldn't be able to make it to work for a while. He believed it the first couple of times before he began to grow impatient, calling me my dad's little pawn before abruptly ending the call. My mom hasn't been out in the garden since that night, and my dad has made no attempt to come back inside. I've even started leaving the glass door open, and yet he remains staring at the pond. One morning around 7 a.m., I went out into the garden. My dad was still asleep, as he usually is around this time, and using what time I had. I walked around the garden, feeling a sense of pride in my dad's attention to detail. The garden was spotless. There wasn't a single flaw, weed, or dead plant in the sight, something quite alien to me before he was locked out. His snores were so loud they managed to drown out the chirping birds overhead. I meandered over to the pond and looked in. It was covered in frog spawn. I felt a little sorry for my dad. He loved this pond so much, and a part of me knew he had grown attached to it over these past few weeks. I picked up a net that had been laid at the side and began shoveling out the frog spawn onto the grassy bank. I must have been in a trance, as my attention was immediately broken by an iron grip seizing my arm and snatching me away, causing me to drop the net into the water. "What the hell are you doing?" His face contorted in rage, his veins bulging out of his head and pulsing in retort to the sudden rush of blood. His face was bright red, which only made the pale pink scar on his cheek and his dark eye bags stand out further. "I'm sorry, Dad, I was just trying to help." Hoisting me up by my collar and gritting his teeth, he stared into my eyes. He looked sad. He looked like he was truly sorry for what he was doing. His anger didn't cease as his fists tightened around my shirt, creasing the fabric as he drove me back towards the door. He froze. Letting go of me immediately, he began gasping for air, clutching at his chest as he dropped to his knees and leaned over. Panic setting in, I rushed to his side and called for an ambulance. Living out there really hadn't done him any good. His condition was unstable. I stayed by his side the entire time, holding his hand and hiding my tears from his gaze. My mom called me after a few hours and told me to come home. One of the hospital staff was kind enough to drive me back like a lamb to slaughter, as I was instantly berated by my mother, shouting and pointing an accusatory finger at me as she erupted into what seemed like a manic episode. "How could you do that to your own father?" She left no room for me to defend myself. "He sacrificed so much for us. Don't you realize that?" She turned, facing the garden, shaking with anger before spinning back around and grabbing her coat. "Stay here. I'm going to go and see your father. So help me God, if I find you in this house and not in the garden, then I'll kill you myself." With that, she slammed the door behind her. The roar of the engine echoed into the distance. I did what I was told. I didn't have much choice, really. I could stay in the house and be dragged out of bed by my mom, coming home shouting at me until the early hours of the morning, or I could wait in the garden for her to come home, which shouldn't take long since hospital visits are up until 11 p.m. It was nice to be in the garden again, despite the waves of guilt I endured over what happened to my dad that morning. I walked around the flower beds, taking in the cool night air before being yanked from the calm and thrown into the depths of my mind to face judgment. I pulled up a chair and sat before the pond. The moon reflected off the water as a couple pond skippers danced across the surface, sending small ripples in all directions. I breathed a deep sigh and looked skyward. It really was beautiful at night. The sky was a sea of shimmering stars. I smiled a little, closing my eyes and dropping my ear to the ground, listening to the rustling leaves and the soft squeaks of mice and hedgehogs. Lowering my head back to the pond, I opened my eyes. I froze. I didn't blink. I couldn't. I was in complete and utter shock, my brain unable to comprehend what it was seeing. Its eyes were a dark shade of purple that pierced right through me. The visible portion of its head was covered in hexagonal scales that were half peeling off to resemble a pine cone, water trickling down the sharp edges. It had no eyelids. It was incapable of blinking. Its eyes were massive, almost bigger than its head. Their pupils were bright green and shaped like a snake, which seemed to swallow me whole. Its face was sunken in several places, making its cheekbones bulge, its skin close to splitting as it tried to remain intact. Its gills flexed periodically, creating deep voids of black across the side of its face. I staggered back, falling over in my chair as the wet earth welcomed me. I scrambled onto my knees and looked back at the pond. Its head was completely visible now. Its jaw was emaciated and hung open, revealing rows and rows of teeth of various sizes and shapes, like a jagged rock formation. A gaping pit of despair that even the water tried to escape as it jetted from within and splashed into the pond. Its nose was non-existent. Where its nose should have been was instead a triangular hole with noticeable signs of rot around the edges, as the pink flesh within pulsed with each snort the beast made. I felt my bladder go as I made it to stand. My heart was racing and my eyes bulging out of their sockets, unable to widen any further. I began to hyperventilate as the creature began to snort and choke, its gills no longer in the water. Its hands shot up, clutching at its throat as it pulled handfuls of water into the void. 3 claws, its nails bright yellow and scabby. Its fingers were bloated, each pulse of its body sending water jetting out from under its nails. I ran for the door. This was crazy. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Slipping on the wet grass, I fell into the door and scrambled to stand. I turned around. The creature was completely out of the pond now, standing upright in the middle of the garden, its hands still cupped around its gills as its mouth moved up and down as if taking in gulps of air. Its skin was held tight around its bones, making them jut out in an irregular pattern, which was even split in several places, revealing the wet bone beneath with the tear long since scabbed over. It took a step towards me. I screamed as I heard its bone crack beneath its weight, sending it crashing to the ground in an agonizing screech. Its clubbed foot thrashed in the air with the trademark 3 claws curling in agony. It rose to its knees, taking in deep breaths as its skin sunk in around its chest, causing each of its ribs to stand out, resembling an accordion. My heart still racing, and my hands were drenched in sweat, I couldn't look away. It began to whimper as it crawled its way back into the pond, dragging its body across the dirt and making a splash as it flung itself back into the water. I sat at the glass door staring at the pond. I stared all night. I stared until the birds began their song, and I stared as the sun rose and blinded me and intensified the burning sensation of my eyes fighting to close. The glass door was opened, and my mother placed her hand on my shoulder, bringing me back inside. She didn't say a word, and she hasn't for the past few weeks. I've not brought the night up to her. She would never believe me. I've not been able to sleep, pacing back and forth in my room, racking my brain over what it just saw. I've tried researching the creature, but my searches all lead to dead ends. I don't know what's happening. My dad's still in hospital, and my mom now sleeps in the garden. I don't know what to do. I don't go in the garden anymore, my heart racing whenever I pass the door. From my window, it looked like there was more frog spawn now. At least that's what I thought. My mom hasn't moved it, and I'm terrified, especially since they've now hatched.